In 1964, Britain had the fastest, lowest-flying, most advanced strike aircraft ever built. It could fly at Mach 2.35 at altitude and hug terrain at 200 feet at near-supersonic speed using technology that wouldn't appear in American aircraft for another 20 years. It was called the TSR-2. The government cancelled it. And then, to make sure nobody could reverse the decision, they ordered every airframe, every jig, every drawing destroyed. This isn't a story about a plane that failed. This is a story about a plane that succeeded and was murdered. But to understand how Britain came to destroy the most advanced strike aircraft on Earth, you have to go back 7 years before it ever flew. Because the TSR-2 was born into a world that was already trying to kill it. In 1957, Defence Minister Duncan Sandys published a white paper that sent a shockwave through the British aviation industry. Its central claim was breathtaking in its arrogance and catastrophic in its consequences. Manned military aircraft, Sandys declared, were essentially obsolete. The future belonged to guided missiles. Britain would develop no more manned interceptors, no more manned bombers. The age of the combat pilot was ending, and Britain would lead the way into the missile age. It was as if someone at the Admiralty had declared in 1905 that the age of warships was over. The 1957 White Paper killed virtually every advanced military aircraft program then under development overnight. Design teams that had been working on the next generation of British fighters and bombers were told to stop. Just stop. Factories that had been tooling up for production runs were told to stand down. Thousands of skilled engineers, draftsmen, stress analysts, aerodynamicists, the human infrastructure that had made Britain a world leader in aviation since the Spitfire, were made redundant in a single policy stroke. Companies that had survived the war, survived the transition to jets, survived the brutal economics of post-war austerity, were gutted. Some never recovered. Sandys was wrong, of course, spectacularly, demonstrably wrong. Manned combat aircraft didn't become obsolete in 1957. They aren't obsolete now, nearly 70 years later. Every major air force on Earth still flies them. But by the time that became undeniable, the damage was done. Britain's aerospace industry had been hollowed out, its pipeline of talent disrupted, its institutional confidence shattered. The country that had produced the Spitfire, the Mosquito, the Meteor, the Canberra, the Lightning, a lineage of innovation stretching back 4 decades, had been told by its own government that none of it mattered anymore. The TSR-2 was one of the very few programs to survive the Sands massacre. It clung to life because its mission profile, low-level nuclear strike against Soviet targets, flying beneath radar coverage at near-supersonic speed, was so specific and so clearly beyond the capability of any missile system that even Sandys couldn't kill it with a straight face. So it lived. Barely. Carrying on its back from birth the weight of a political establishment that had already decided manned military aviation was a relic. Every cost overrun, every technical delay, every bureaucratic friction point would be amplified by people who'd already concluded the whole enterprise was a waste. The TSR-2 didn't just have to fly, it had to justify its own existence every single day against an establishment that resented it for surviving when everything else had been killed. And fly it did. On the morning of 27th September 1964, at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire, a white aircraft, unlike anything Britain had ever produced, rolled onto the runway. Angular, purposeful. It looked less like an aeroplane and more like a weapon that happened to have a cockpit. At the controls sat Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, a man who'd flown Typhoons against the Luftwaffe who'd been the first British pilot to break Mach 1 in level flight, who'd test flown both the English Electric Lightning and the Canberra before it. Beaumont was, by any reasonable measure, the most experienced test pilot Britain had. And the aircraft beneath him was the most ambitious it had ever built. TSR-2. Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance, Mach 2. Behind Beaumont sat his navigator, Don Bowen, surrounded by an avionics suite so advanced that nothing comparable would exist in any Western Air Force for years, or, in the case of certain systems, for decades. The TSR-2 came from BAC, British Aircraft Corporation, formed in 1960 from the merger of several of Britain's most accomplished aircraft companies, most notably English Electric and Vickers Armstrongs. The design originated primarily from English Electric's team at Warplane in Lancashire, and the pedigree of that team is essential context. These were the people who'd built the Canberra, one of the most successful jet bombers in aviation history, an aircraft that served with air forces on every continent and remained in military use for over 50 years. The same team then produced the Lightning, Britain's first and only indigenous Mach 2 interceptor, an aircraft of breathtaking performance that could climb almost vertically. Led by chief designer Freddie Page, validated in the air by Beaumont, they brought all of that accumulated expertise directly into the TSR-2. This wasn't some speculative venture by unknown engineers. This was the finest design office in Britain, and they had the track record to prove it. The engines tell a similar story. Two Bristol Siddeley Olympus 320s, each producing 30,000 pounds of thrust in reheat. That same Olympus engine family would later power Concorde. The power plant that propelled the TSR-2 over the English countryside in 1964 would carry passengers across the Atlantic at Mach 2 in the 1970s. But getting there hadn't been easy, not remotely. The Olympus 320 was a new and punishingly demanding variant of the engine, and during early flight testing it suffered from vibration issues, the normal growing pains of a new power plant installation, as Beaumont himself noted, but problems that cost time and money, and that gave the programme's political enemies ammunition. Every technical hiccup became another line item in a Treasury memo arguing the whole thing was out of control. These were real problems, nobody pretends otherwise, but they were engineering problems, not fundamental design failures, the kind that every complex aircraft program in history has encountered. The F-111, the aircraft that would supposedly replace the TSR-2, would itself experience severe cost overruns and technical difficulties during its own development. Problems at least as serious as those used to justify killing the TSR-2. The history of military aviation is a history of solving problems that initially look terrifying. The TSR-2's issues were being addressed, flight by flight, test by test. The Olympus engines would have been resolved. What the program needed was time. What it got was an election. Here's what you need to understand about the TSR-2's revolution. It wasn't speed. Speed was just the envelope. The revolution was what sat behind that long, elegantly pointed radome and in the equipment bays surrounding Don Bowen's rear cockpit. Three systems formed the core of it, and understanding what they were, and when equivalent technology appeared anywhere else, is the only way to grasp the full scale of what Britain threw away. First, terrain-following radar. The Scottish electronics firm Ferranti built what was, by most authoritative accounts, the first terrain-following radar developed specifically for an operational strike aircraft. A monopulse radar system that scanned the terrain ahead and fed data directly into the automatic flight control system, allowing the aircraft to fly at 200 feet above the ground at near-supersonic speed without any pilot input. Hug the Earth so closely that Soviet radar systems, designed to detect high-altitude bombers, simply couldn't track you. Precision matters here. The American General Dynamics F-111, which entered service in 1967, also carried terrain-following radar developed by Texas Instruments. Both programs were developed roughly concurrently. So for terrain-following radar in isolation, the TSR-2's lead was measured in years, not decades, perhaps 2 or 3. But terrain-following radar was only one piece. The second system was forward-looking infrared, FLIR. The TSR-2 was designed to carry an infrared sensor suite, enabling the crew to detect and identify targets in darkness and poor visibility, providing a thermal image of the terrain and target area ahead. This wasn't a bolt-on afterthought. It wasn't an upgrade pod to be fitted at some future date. It was part of the aircraft's core mission system from the day the specification was written. And here's where the timeline becomes devastating. The Panavia Tornado GR-1 entered RAF service in the early 1980s. It didn't carry FLIR. It was only when the TIALD pod, thermal imaging and laser designation, was rushed into service on Tornado GR-1S during the 1991 Gulf War that RAF strike aircraft finally possessed an infrared targeting capability comparable in concept to what the TSR-2 had been designed with in 1964. The TIALD pod deployed operationally for the first time in February 1991, 26 years after the TSR-2's cancellation. That isn't a gap of months. That's an entire generation of pilots who trained, flew, fought, and retired in the space between the TSR-2's death and the arrival of a capability it was born with. The third pillar was Ferranti's inertial navigation and attack system. In 1964, inertial navigation was cutting edge. Gyroscope-based systems that could determine position, speed, and heading without any external reference, making the aircraft independent of ground-based navigation aids that could be jammed or destroyed in wartime. The TSR-2 system was designed not merely to navigate, but to deliver the aircraft to its target with the precision required for nuclear or conventional weapon release, integrating navigation data with the terrain-following radar and the infrared sensors into a single coherent picture. That integration, that's the real claim. Not any single system in isolation, but all three talking to each other, feeding into a unified attack system. Terrain-following radar, forward-looking infrared, inertial navigation, all integrated into one low-level strike platform. In 1964, no American aircraft had this, no Soviet aircraft, no European aircraft. The F-111 carried terrain-following radar, certainly, but its overall avionics integration didn't match the level of ambition that defined the TSR-2 from inception. The TSR-2 wasn't conceived as a fast aircraft that happened to carry advanced electronics. It was an integrated weapons system in which the avionics were the primary capability, and the airframe was, in a sense, the delivery vehicle. That conceptual approach, the aircraft as a flying sensor and computer platform, wouldn't become standard in Western strike aircraft design until the 1980s and 1990s. The sum wasn't merely greater than its parts. The sum was 20 years ahead of anyone else's parts. During 24 test flights, Beament confirmed the aircraft's handling qualities were superb, its low-speed characteristics excellent, its potential extraordinary. He described it as the finest aircraft he'd ever flown. From the man who'd put the Lightning and Canberra through their paces, that verdict carried a weight that's difficult to overstate. The flight envelope was being expanded carefully and methodically, exactly as every responsible test program proceeds. Everything was moving in the right direction. And then the election happened. On 15th of October 1964, less than 3 weeks after the TSR-2's triumphant maiden flight, the British general election returned Harold Wilson's Labour Party to power with a majority of 4 seats. Wilson became Prime Minister. Denis Healey became Secretary of State for Defence. And the TSR-2, which had survived every technical challenge thrown at it, now faced an enemy against which no amount of engineering brilliance could prevail: political expedience. The programme had been dogged by cost overruns. Original estimates sat in the region of £90 million. By 1964, projected costs had escalated dramatically, with unit prices climbing far beyond what Treasury officials found acceptable. In an era of brutal pressure on defence spending and a looming balance of payments crisis, these numbers made the TSR-2 a target. But the aircraft's enemies weren't confined to the Treasury. Not even close. Lord Mountbatten, Chief of the Defence Staff, had been waging a quiet, relentless campaign against the TSR-2 for years. A naval man to his marrow, a man whose entire identity was wrapped in the senior service, Mountbatten saw the RAF's expensive land-based strike programme as a direct competitor for resources that he believed should flow to the Royal Navy and its carrier fleet. Every pound spent on the TSR-2 was, in Mountbatten's calculation, a pound stolen from the fleet. So he set about killing it with the full arsenal of a well-connected political operator. He lobbied against the programme within the defence establishment, used his considerable political connections to undermine it, and is reported to have openly disparaged it to anyone who would listen. This wasn't professional disagreement conducted through proper channels. This was a campaign orchestrated by the most politically sophisticated military officer in Britain, a man who had the ear of the royal family and knew how to use it. Mountbatten didn't care whether the TSR-2 worked. He didn't care if it was brilliant. He needed it dead because it was eating his budget. And he pursued that goal with a ruthlessness that makes the Treasury's bean counting look almost principled by comparison. There was an American dimension too. The United States government and General Dynamics were actively promoting the F-111 as an alternative, and there was significant pressure on Britain to buy American rather than build British. The Wilson government, desperate to maintain the closest possible relationship with Washington, was receptive. The arguments were seductive: buy off the shelf, save money, reduce risk. They were also, as events would brutally demonstrate, completely wrong. The blow fell on the 6th of April 1965. In the budget speech delivered to the House of Commons, the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that the TSR-2 programme was cancelled. Denis Healey confirmed the decision in the defence context, arguing that costs had become unsustainable and that the General Dynamics F-111, purchased from the Americans in a variant designated the F-111K, would provide equivalent capability at lower cost and risk. Pragmatic, responsible, financially unavoidable. That's how they sold it. At Wharton and across BAC's facilities, the announcement struck like a bereavement. Engineers who'd devoted years of their lives to the programme learned their work was over. Beaumont, the man who'd lifted XR-219 into the sky and brought it back with the verdict that this was the finest aircraft he'd ever flown, was devastated. The flight test programme terminated immediately. XR-219 had completed 24 flights. It would never fly again. But here's the thing. And this is the detail that transforms a painful procurement story into something that feels like a national betrayal. Having destroyed Britain's indigenous strike aircraft to buy an American replacement, the Wilson government ordered 50 F-111K aircraft from General Dynamics. The K designated the British variant. Contracts were signed. Britain committed itself to dependence on an American aircraft that was itself experiencing severe cost overruns and technical difficulties, problems that were, with an irony so heavy it's almost unbearable, at least as serious as those used to justify killing the TSR-2. Then, in January 1968, less than 3 years later, the Wilson government cancelled the F-111K order as well. The same government, the same political party, the same logic, the same Dennis Healey. Britain had destroyed its own aircraft to buy an American one, and then couldn't afford the American one either. The RAF was left with neither the TSR-2 nor the F-111K. The elderly Blackburn Buccaneer, a fine aircraft, but one designed for carrier-based naval strike, not the high-speed overland penetration mission the TSR-2 had been built for, was pressed into service as a stopgap. The gap wouldn't be fully addressed until the Tornado entered service in the early 1980s, developed as a multinational program with West Germany and Italy because Britain could no longer afford to build a major strike aircraft alone. The Tornado was capable, but it was a compromise born of multinational negotiation. It didn't match the TSR-2's performance envelope, and it didn't carry integrated FLIR until the 1990s, the very capability the TSR-2 had been designed with from the start. Every argument used to kill the TSR-2, every claim of cost savings, every promise of equivalent capability, was demolished within 3 years by the very people who made them. At the end of it all, Britain had spent years of development money, destroyed a working aircraft, destroyed the tooling to build more, ordered 50 American replacements it couldn't afford, cancelled those too, and ended up with nothing. Nothing at all. But governments cancel programs. That happens. It's painful, sometimes wrong, but it happens in every country, every era. What happened next with the TSR-2 was not normal. What happened next is the act that cannot be forgiven. In the weeks and months following the April 1965 cancellation, an order was issued, and the precise origin remains bitterly disputed, with Healey, senior civil servants in the Ministry of Defence, and the Ministry of Aviation all variously blamed, to destroy not merely the programme, but its physical remains. Not mothball, not store, not transfer to a research establishment. Destroy. 9 development airframes had been ordered. XR-219, the only aircraft to fly, was grounded. XR-220, the second airframe, had been virtually complete, weeks from joining the test programme when the axe fell. The remaining airframes, XR-221 through XR-227, were in various stages of construction. Under the destruction order, incomplete airframes were to be scrapped. But the treatment of the more complete examples went beyond scrapping into something that looked, to the engineers who witnessed it, like punishment. Airframes XR-221 and XR-223 were transported to the Proof and Experimental Establishment at Shoeburyness in Essex, a weapons testing range on the bleak Thames estuary mudflats, and used as gunnery targets. Picture that for a moment. White fuselages that months before had represented the most sophisticated strike aircraft on Earth, sitting on a mudflat, being blasted apart by high-explosive shells, while men in concrete bunkers measured the fragmentation patterns. The official justification was weapons effects testing, gathering data on how aircraft structures behaved when hit by various projectiles. As if this data couldn't have been gathered on any scrap airframe in the country. As if the most advanced avionics bays ever designed in Britain were necessary to test what happens when you shoot a piece of aluminium. The excuse was transparent. The intent was annihilation. And it wasn't just the airframes. Across BAC's facilities, teams arrived with torches and cutting equipment. The jigs, massive precision fixtures, some of them filling entire factory bays, engineered to hold airframe components in exact alignment during assembly, irreplaceable structures that represented not just metal but the physical ability to build more TSR-2s, were ordered cut up and scrapped. Men who had built those jigs, who had aligned them to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, stood and watched as they were reduced to scrap. Production tooling was destroyed. And then, in what many regard as the most unforgivable act of all, a significant proportion of the design drawings, the accumulated technical knowledge of the program, thousands upon thousands of detailed engineering documents representing millions of man-hours of work, was ordered destroyed. Not archived, not classified and locked away, destroyed. The factory floors were cleared as if the TSR-2 had never existed, as if you could erase genius with a cutting torch and a skip. The destruction had a single unmistakable purpose: to ensure that no future government, no matter how willing, could ever reverse the decision. You can restart a cancelled program if the jigs still exist, if the drawings survive, if the airframes sit in storage. You cannot restart anything if every physical trace has been annihilated. This wasn't cancellation, this was erasure. Programs get cancelled all the time. The Canadian Avro Arrow was cancelled. That's its own heartbreak, its own parallel story of Commonwealth self-destruction. But the deliberate, systematic obliteration of every trace, every airframe, every jig, every drawing, that's something qualitatively different. That's ensuring the decision can never be questioned, never revisited, never reversed. That's not fiscal responsibility. That's institutional cowardice hardened into policy. A government so uncertain of its own judgment that it needed to destroy the evidence before anyone could prove them wrong. And when the F111K was cancelled 3 years later, there was nothing to go back to. No airframes to pull from storage, no jigs to restart production, no drawings to hand to a new contractor. The destruction had worked exactly as intended. The door wasn't merely closed, it was burned. What happened to the people? This might be the cruelest part of all. The engineers, the designers, the stress analysts and avionics specialists and aerodynamicists who'd poured their expertise into the TSR-2. They didn't just disappear into quiet retirement. When the cancellation hit, BAC shed thousands of jobs. Wharton and Weybridge and Preston went through waves of redundancies that gutted departments which had taken a decade to build. And unlike a factory closure, where workers can find similar employment down the road, these were people with skills so specialised that only a handful of employers on Earth could use them. Britain, having just declared that it didn't want those skills, was not among them. Many left the country entirely. Some of the best minds in British aviation, discovering that their country had destroyed its most advanced aircraft and no longer valued what they could do, emigrated to the United States, to France, to anywhere that still wanted them. And who could blame them? Their own country had just destroyed their life's work and told them it wasn't needed. And what those nations were getting was extraordinary. These weren't just competent engineers. These were people who had solved problems in high-speed aerodynamics, avionics integration, and low-level flight regimes that nobody else in the world had even attempted yet. Within a decade of the TSR-2's cancellation, you could trace British fingerprints across aerospace programs on 2 continents. A silent diaspora of talent that Britain had paid to train and other nations got for free. This is what people mean when they talk about brain drain, but the phrase is too clinical. It was more like a hemorrhage. The team that had built the Canberra, the Lightning, and the TSR-2, a design lineage representing the absolute pinnacle of British aeronautical achievement, was scattered across 2 continents. You can rebuild jigs, you can redraw plans, though they didn't even leave that option. But you cannot reassemble the institutional knowledge that lives in the heads of engineers who've spent 15 years learning how to solve problems no one else has even identified yet. That knowledge walked out the gates of Warton and Weybridge and, for the most part, never came back. And the damage compounded. Without the TSR-2, there was no follow-on program. Without a follow-on program, there was no reason for the next generation of graduates to choose aerospace. Without that next generation, the capability gap widened. The country that had produced the Canberra, the Lightning, and the most advanced strike aircraft of its generation found itself, within a decade of the TSR-2's destruction, unable to develop a major combat aircraft without foreign partners. And that's where Britain remains today. A handful of airframes survived, not through any official program of preservation, but because individual people, engineers, museum officials, stubborn men and women who understood what they were looking at, refused to let the last evidence be destroyed. XR-220, the second airframe, the one that was weeks from flight, sits at the Royal Air Force Museum site at Cosford in Shropshire. XR-222 is at the Imperial War Museum site at Duxford in Cambridgeshire. There are pieces, nose sections, cockpit assemblies, scattered across a few other collections. 3, perhaps 4 substantially intact examples. That's all. Out of everything that was built, everything that was planned, everything that was dreamed, that's what's left. They sit in their hangars, these silent white machines, stripped of their engines, their canopies slightly clouded with age, surrounded by schoolchildren who wander past without the faintest idea what they're looking at. They are beautiful. They are heartbreaking. 60 years on, they still look like the future, which is exactly the problem. They were the future in 1964. They predicted terrain-following radar, forward-looking infrared, integrated avionics, the entire philosophy of modern strike warfare. They predicted all of it, and they were destroyed for it. Not because they didn't work, because they did. They sit there still, the fastest, lowest-flying, most advanced strike aircraft of their generation, preserved not out of respect, but because a handful of people refused to let the last evidence be destroyed. They are all that remains of the day Britain decided it no longer deserved to be great. Subscribe for more stories like this.